US President Joe Biden says he's outraged by Israel's killing of international aid workers in Gaza. The 7 victims joined the nearly 200 Palestinian relief workers killed by Israeli forces. He's attacking aid supplies, one of the tactics in Israel's genocidal war. This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I am Hashem Ahelbarra. Israel made sure no one would survive an attack targeting a clearly marked aid convoy in Gaza on Monday. An Al Jazeera investigation has revealed 3 missiles deliberately hit the 3 vehicles in 3 separate strikes by a drone, killing a Palestinian and 6 foreign citizens. An outrage, says US President Joe Biden, using words much stronger than he's used before about Israel's actions in Gaza, much stronger than even after the killing of nearly 200 Palestinian aid workers by Israel, not to mention people queuing for food. So why are such attacks happening so often? Is it a deliberate strategy by Israel to block aid and therefore kill more Palestinians? And why such an attack now, with the need for supplies at its most critical and when people are dying of starvation? We'll get to our guests in a moment. First, this report from Kulthum Sharif.
Mounting global anger after Israel kills 7 aid workers in Gaza on Monday. An Al Jazeera investigation has found 3 consecutive strikes deliberately targeted the clearly identified convoy of international aid workers in Deir al-Balah. They worked for the US-based organization World Central Kitchen. It's prompted the strongest condemnation yet from Israel's closest ally, the United States. In a statement issued by the White House, President Joe Biden blamed Israel for not doing enough to protect aid workers and civilians.
Why is the U.S. not condemning the strike?
I think by saying we're outraged, I think you can fairly characterize that as condemning the strike itself. Of course, I mean, nobody wants to see this kind of violence happen to humanitarian aid workers.
Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu admitted his forces launched the attack, but says it was unintentional.
There was a tragic incident of an unintended strike of our forces on innocent people in the Gaza Strip. This happens in war. We are checking this thoroughly. We are in touch with the governments and we will do everything for this not to happen again.
The Israeli military says it's investigating the strikes that killed a US-Canadian dual citizen, an Australian, a Polish national, 3 British citizens and a Palestinian. But it's further straining ties between Israel and its allies.
This is completely unacceptable. The Israeli government has accepted responsibility for this.
The United Nations says nearly 200 aid workers have been killed in the nearly 6 months since Israel launched its war on Gaza. Most of them are UN staff killed while operating in areas considered safe. The Israeli military has been accused of blocking aid, attacking aid convoys, and even starving civilians trying to get food supplies.
This is unconscionable, but it is an inevitable result of the way the war is being conducted. It demonstrates yet again the urgent need for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire.
Monday's attack on the aid workers has forced several charities to suspend their operations in Gaza in a major setback for the recently opened sea route for food aid. UN agencies have been warning of famine in northern Gaza, where Israel has blocked aid from entering. The rest of the Palestinian territory is facing catastrophic levels of hunger.
The World Central Kitchen was feeding many people, providing them with support. Without it, people don't know where to turn, so there will definitely be a lot of hunger.
The killing of international charity workers has put humanitarian supplies to the Strip in doubt. While President Biden has condemned Israel for killing of the aid workers, his administration continues to arm and fund Israel's relentless war on Gaza. Kulthum Sharif, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's go to our panel now. In Ramallah, we have Bushra Khalidi, policy lead in the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel for the aid charity Oxfam. In London, Chris Gunness, a human rights activist and former spokesman for UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which supports Palestinian refugees. Also in the occupied West Bank, Sari Bashi, program director of Human Rights Watch. Welcome to the program. Bushra, this was the moment when people were hoping that finally we'll see more aid workers delivering aid into Gaza. And suddenly the attack took place in clearly marked vehicles run by the World Central Kitchen. What was your reaction when you heard the news?
I mean, of course, Israel's deliberate targeting of all aspects of life in Gaza is already utterly unacceptable. But now with this incident and the rise generally in attacks against aid workers is also utterly unacceptable. Over, the past 6 months, we've witnessed Oxfam and other organizations that we're, working closely on the ground with an unprecedented assault on humanitarian efforts, with Israeli authorities knowingly striking locations provided by humanitarian teams for aid delivery and assistance. And so it's clear no one's safe in Gaza. Nowhere is safe in Gaza. And Israel must stop its egregious and systematic and continuous violations of IHL.
Chris, as you know, aid convoys coordinate their movements with the Kogat, which is a civilian body affiliated with the Israeli army. Now, you've been in touch with the World Central Kitchen. Do we have to take the Israelis at face value when they say this was a misidentification?
We absolutely do not. And an investigation, an impartial investigation, which Mr. Netanyahu has promised both Rishi Sunak and Joe Biden, will determine whether that is the case. But let us look at the facts as we know them. The Israelis were fully sighted on every millimetre of the journey of that convoy. The sea route from Cyprus was established in full sight with Israeli approval. Every inch of the road that the convoy went along, from the warehouse to the kitchens, all of that was notified. And the transport, the actual vehicles, and we're talking to detail, the vehicles were marked, the people in the vehicles were all notified to the Israelis. There was an attack on the first vehicle, and I'm told that what happened is that people then left the first vehicle, those were alive and were wounded, but that could. They went to the second vehicle. There are some reports that the Israelis were notified that the first vehicle had been hit. Then not long afterwards, the second vehicle had been was hit in spite of all the notifications. The bodies and those who were able were brought to the third vehicle. The Israelis, again, so it's reported, were notified about the strike on the second vehicle. And lo and behold, there was a strike on the third vehicle. Now, Mr. Netanyahu, in the clip that you've just played, talked about an incident, a strike. There weren't. There were 3 strikes, Mr. Netanyahu. So to pretend that it was a one-off mistake, no, there were 3 of them. And that suggests that there is a policy. And, you asked the question in your headlines, is there a deliberate strategy, a deliberate policy of targeting these people? I'm afraid it's hard to conclude that there isn't, that there clearly is. There's a policy called the Rules of Engagement, which set out at every level in the Israeli army how they engage with the enemy, how they, the rules that determine who gets fired on, etc. And that policy has led to tens of thousands of women and children being killed and nearly 200 aid workers.
Sari, the Israeli army says it's going to conduct a thorough, impartial investigation. Should we trust the findings when there is no international oversight of this investigation?
My concern is that this is unfortunately far from the first time the Israeli military has killed humanitarian workers in Gaza and also struck ambulances and other clearly marked humanitarian vehicles. On a number of occasions, they've said that they would conduct investigations, in particular of some of the ambulance strikes, and we have not seen any results of those investigations. I'm also worried that they're saying they will conduct investigations, maybe because the people killed were foreign citizens, particularly of Western countries. When 32,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, the vast majority women and children, and we don't hear about investigations into those deaths. So no, I am concerned that the investigation is not something that would be trustworthy. And what we need is for the International Criminal Court to move more quickly in its investigation into potential serious international crimes committed both in Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel.
Bushra, the world seems to forget that almost 200 brave relief workers were killed in Gaza over the last few months. Where does this all leave the work of the NGOs that have been bravely operating on the ground to deliver aid to those who need it most?
I mean, yesterday's events, again, are not isolated. We're almost at 200 aid workers killed, including UN workers. We have 300 health workers from the Palestinian Health Ministry that have been killed. We have almost 100 journalists killed and, almost 15,000 children killed. Gaza has become the most dangerous place on earth for these, groups of people. And it leaves us at a complete crossroads where we're having to ask ourselves, are we abiding by our duty of care and our principles as humanitarian under international law in sending our colleagues to the field? But we have those conversations with our colleagues all the time. As to whether we continue operations, we scale up, we scale down, this is always a conversation, an ongoing one, because this has been happening since the beginning. And this, the risk of being killed in the field is something that, is not new again. And it's of course, the impact of suspension of operations is, massive at this stage. With starvation and famine-like conditions and famine underway, essentially, Israel's using starvation, again, as a weapon of war to collectively punish an entire population. And instead of letting us do our job properly in accordance with international law.
Chris, when you look at what World Central Kitchen has achieved so far, is really impressive compared to what should global players do. So they had their own tugboat barge, which reached Gaza in mid-March, and they were able to prepare the landing area in the northern Gaza, and they started to deliver aid. Now, with them suspending their operations, where does it leave the north, which has been suffering most in the Strip?
We have to put the spotlight on where it should be, and that is the Israeli authorities, the occupying power, because as we speak, for the second day in a row, there have been no convoys. Israel is blocking UN convoys. There are dozens of trucks at Rafah full of hundreds of thousands of tons of food and other aid waiting to get in. The UN has notified the Israelis that it wants these trucks to go in, and Israel simply has not approved them. So, yes, there has been considerable achievement by Chef Andrea and the World Central Kitchen, and I applaud that, but that in no way takes the pressure off Israel as the occupying power in compliance with the provisional order from the International Court of Justice to open all of the borders, and that there should be unimpeded, unrestricted humanitarian access, that the Israelis should be cooperating with the United Nations. The Security Council, in its latest resolution, has also said the same thing. And as Sari has alluded to, the ICC, the Rome Statute is very clear that food cannot be used as a weapon of war. So there's a triple violation: the Security Council, the ICJ, and the Rome Statute. Israel must be held to account. What is different this time is that, for example, 3 British workers have been killed. And whereas before we had, after the 2007-2008 Gaza war, we had the Goldstone report, and the Israelis used their scare tactics and they crushed that, and the world buckled. The Goldstone report, it was a brilliant report, was kicked into the long grass. Yuval Diskin, the then head of Shin Bet, went to Ramallah and threatened President Abbas. He said we'd turn the West Bank into Gaza if this report goes forward. So some pretty strong-arm tactics were used and the world buckled. This time, however, Sunak has been told by Netanyahu there will be an independent investigation. Well, I can tell you, the British media are all over this, and they're going to want to see that independent investigation. And guess what? They're going to want to see individual criminal responsibility. And that means the people who killed these people are responsible for the killing of these people are held to criminal account. They need to be punished. And that is something different with the killing of these 7 foreign workers. There's a Palestinian amongst them, and of course there has to be accountability for him too. But can I just make one other point? 171 UNRWA workers were killed. Joe Biden picks up the phone and says to Chef Andrea, I'm outraged, it's disgraceful, there must be an independent investigation. Does he pick up the phone to Commissioner General Lazzarini or Secretary General Antonio Guterres and say, I'm outraged that 171 UNRWA Palestinian workers have been killed? No, he hasn't, and that's outrageous. It's a double standard. And just as Sari said, beyond that, 32,000 Palestinians have been killed. Each and every one of those has a dignity and a destiny that must be investigated, must be respected. There must be full accountability for all of those killings.
Sari, obviously, when you listen to the Israeli officials, they're trying to contain the ramifications from the international outcry. Do you think this could be a pivotal moment in the sense it could rally international push to hold the Israelis accountable for what has been happening in Gaza over the last few months?
I certainly hope so. So just to be clear, countries that are supplying the Israeli military with arms, like the United States, like Germany, like the UK, risk being complicit in further grave abuses if they continue doing so. So this can end pretty quickly if the United States were to abide by its obligations under international law, as well as under US domestic law, and suspend arms transfers to the Israeli military. That would be a very clear message that unlawful strikes need to end and that withholding and impeding the delivery of humanitarian aid need to end. U.S. domestic law also forbids the United States from supplying arms to militaries that are blocking U.S.-supplied humanitarian aid. So that makes sense. If men with guns are stopping you from getting the aid that the United States is providing, the U.S. should stop providing those guns. If those actions are taken, this could be a turning point. And I really hope so, because with those ships laden with food turning around back towards Cyprus and the truck route still mostly closed, people in Gaza can't really wait much longer.
Well, this comes against the backdrop of growing international concerns about the potential for more aid into Gaza. And aid agencies are saying it's about time to deliver aid or thousands and thousands of people could die. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Galant said on October the 9th that no aid will be allowed into Gaza. Let's listen to what he had to say.
I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals, and we act accordingly.
Bushra, what's next for humanitarian aid into Gaza? Are we likely to see more pressure on the NGOs, organizations that have been operating there to say, we have to pull out because it's really risky?
I mean, the context is ever evolving and is fastly changing. So we're, of course, adaptive and flexible. What is incredible by many of these organizations operating on the ground and that been here for decades, including Oxfam, is that we work through the local communities. So, our operations are all mostly through our local partners that are not only humanitarian workers, but they're also members of the community. They're also trying to look for the next meal for their kids and for their family. And they're trying to survive every day. And so, of course, the pressure is on them. The pressure is, those conversations are ongoing. But I surely hope that, this conversation has brought clearly what needs to happen so that aid can come in. Creative ways of delivering aid. Aid should be delivered how it's always been delivered before the 7th of October in Gaza, through all of the routes, the land routes that are available, because that would also not make our aid response so expensive. And also we need access. We need to be able to bring teams in. And there's been persistent and systematic denials also of permits and visas. We have an entire team in the West Bank that could be also deployed to Gaza. We're not allowed to go to Gaza, and we're only an hour away. So there are many solutions that could be tomorrow activated at the will of Israel and its closest allies.
Chris, the World Central Kitchen accounts for more than half of UN deliveries, mostly food to the people in Gaza. They delivered 43 million meals since October. They provide 50,000 hot meals on a daily basis to the people. All that is gone. What's next for the people of Gaza?
And you have to look at why. And the reason is that the Israelis are not allowing food in. I pay tribute to Oxfam, and I think what Bushra has said is absolutely right. Their work is extraordinary, and if the Israelis let them, they could do more. But to be clear, UNRWA is the only organization, the single largest organization that can really deliver aid at scale. There were, before the war, 1.2 million people on UNRWA's food distribution list. That figure will have risen exponentially. It's probably somewhere nearer 2 million by now. They simply don't have the data. But the fact is that UNRWA has now gone through something of a resurgence. You had this Israeli attack. You have the defunding by certain donors. They're all now coming back. UNRWA has worked through this. The Israelis tried to isolate UNRWA, and UNRWA again has now got support from UN agencies and is looking to move forward to deliver aid at scale as the ICJ has demanded. And what is happening? Israel is continuing to block the aid. There are hundreds of trucks waiting at Rafah to get in. So looking forward, UNRWA can deliver. We've now got a situation where the donors have come back. The dodgy dossier which the Israelis produced with these false allegations against UNRWA staff members, that's all fallen away. We don't know, there's no evidence of that whatsoever. UNRWA has really come back now, and I pay tribute to UNRWA for picking itself up, and it's now in a position where it could deliver aid at scale. You need to ask the Israelis now, because the Biden administration is very clear, Sunak is very clear, all of the UNRWA donors are clear, the International Court of Justice is clear, the ICC is clear, all of those mechanisms are clear that Israel has to allow aid to be delivered at scale. UNRWA is the main organization that can do that, and if that does not happen, Israel will be accused, and will be rightfully accused, of genocide and using starvation, mass starvation, as a weapon of war. The world simply cannot allow Israel to get away with doing that, because the lives of 2.3 million people today are at stake.
Sari, as well as you work with Human Rights Watch, you co-founded the Israeli human rights group Gisha, which has been campaigning for freedom of movement of Palestinians and also for aid for the Palestinian people for years. The nature of the blockade, of blocking the access to the people in Gaza now, how does it compare with past experiences, with past years?
I mean, in some cases, it's unprecedented. In the 5 wars that have taken place since 2008, the Israeli military has never blocked water, fuel, electricity in the way that it has done now, and it has always allowed aid shipments in, even during very significant fighting. And they saw that as something they needed to do, and the international community held them accountable for that. In some ways, there is a precedent because there was a period of time when the Israeli military counted the number of calories that it would allow people in Gaza to consume as part of a policy to deliberately restrict people in Gaza to no more than that. But this goes well below it. In other words, the Israeli military has calculations about how much food people in Gaza need, and it knows very well that we're going well below that. Maybe back in 2008, when the Israeli military first began restricting food supplies into Gaza, albeit not at this level, maybe if the response had been stronger, they wouldn't have been encouraged to take it to this next step, which is actually using starvation as a weapon of war.
Bushra, Oxfam may find itself in a position where it has to team up with other NGOs to deliver aid. How does it really feel?
It feels like, you're sending your colleagues into a battlefield, and everywhere is a battlefield in Gaza. There's been, it's not localized. It's systematic and has been relentless. I wanted to add another point. It's not just about food. It's about every aspect of life. When you've reached the starvation level, you don't need just food. You need nutrients. You need healthcare. You need a doctor. You need to be systematically seeing and consistently seeing a doctor, and that's not available in Gaza. We need to clear the rubble. We can't deliver aid when there's no roads. And so instead of, for example, building a 250 million, floating port, we should be using that to get machinery in that Gaza does not have to clear the amount of rubble that could take up to 2 years actually to clear out. I mean, effectively, what we need right now is a complete permanent ceasefire so that we can do our job. We actually not only operate through local partners, we actually operate through UNRWA as well. We provide trainings in UNRWA shelters. We use UNRWA warehouses. So I completely agree with my colleague. We cannot do this without the UNRWA humanitarian arm that has been also operating in Gaza for decades and knows the communities. We are the experts and we are there on the ground. And so I don't see us leaving Gaza in that way because we form part of the community.
Chris, in less than a minute, if you don't mind, in the absence of strong indications of a ceasefire, a deal between Hamas and the Israelis, with the situation evolving on the ground, do you still believe there could be a breakthrough?
Well, I certainly pray there is a breakthrough, but there's so much internal division within Israel about the strategy. Is the strategy to defeat Hamas? Is the strategy to bring the hostages out? And this is the problem, that these crimes are going on. There's mass starvation in Gaza. And as ever, the fate of Gaza is held hostage, forgive the expression, by internal Israeli politics. And until that can be clarified, there will be further confusion. But to be very clear, the buck stops with Mr. Netanyahu has invoked the Amalek biblical genocide, with President Herzog, who has said that you can't distinguish between ordinary civilians and Hamas. And you have Galant, who said, you know, there'll be a complete, as you had in your clip, a complete blockade. And these people have to be held to individual criminal account. Whatever happens with the hostages, we have to see all of the borders open. And we have to see those responsible held to criminal account.
Sari, we're not really hearing strong voices in Israel condemning what is happening, particularly from a purely legal perspective.
I mean, there are some voices. There's right now a petition in the Israeli Supreme Court from a number of human rights groups calling for the Israeli military to allow aid into Gaza and to actually supply it, which is part of its obligations as occupying power. We have seen demonstrations and posts from people making similar calls. I think that, there's been a lot of inconsistency. So within Israel, people were appropriately horrified by the October 7th Hamas-led attacks that killed so many civilians in southern Israel. And the outrage comes from the fact that armed groups were targeting civilians. But that principle has to apply irrespective of whether the civilians are Israeli or Palestinian. So when the Israeli military is withholding food from civilians in Gaza, that has to spark the same amount of outrage, both in Israel as well as among Israeli allies.
We'll have to leave it there. Really appreciate your insights. Sari, Bashi, Chris, Gunness, and Bushra Khalidi. Looking forward to having the same conversation with you in the near future. Thank you. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem Ahelbarra, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.